The dust was a prayer Elias Thorne no longer knew how to speak. It settled on the brim of his hat, on the cracked leather of his saddle, on the silent tombstone that marked the grave of his wife and son. His ranch was a kingdom of ghosts, ruled by the tyranny of routine. He would wake before the sun, mend fences that held nothing in, and stare at a horizon that promised only another day just like the last. Grief was not a visitor in his house, it was the foundation, the walls, the very air he breathed. He was a man hollowed out, a walking echo in the shape of what he once was. He rode not with purpose, but from a need to feel the burn of the wind, something other than the cold ache in his chest. The sun was a merciless god, beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth. It was in this unforgiving glare that he saw them. 3 small shapes, huddled together like shivering quail, their backs to him. They were knelt by a puddle, a scummy, brown depression in the baked clay where rainwater had gone to die. He pulled his horse, Jericho, to a halt. The creak of the saddle was the only sound. For a moment, he thought they were animals. But then one of them moved, the oldest, a boy with hair the color of straw, and Elias saw the impossibly thin arms, the tattered rags that passed for clothes. The boy dipped a cupped hand into the muck and brought it to the lips of a smaller child, a girl. A third, barely a toddler, was already drinking, his small face buried in the filth. A sickness rose in Elias's throat, hot and bitter. It was a feeling so sharp, so unwelcome, it felt like a violation of the numbness he had so carefully cultivated. He dismounted, his boot sinking into the dust with a soft crunch. The sound made the oldest boy whip his head around. His eyes were not a child's eyes. They were ancient, filled with a defiant terror that made Elias pause. He was maybe 12, but he stood up with the grim finality of a man making his last stand, positioning himself in front of the other 2. The girl looked up, her face streaked with mud and tears. The youngest simply stared, his mouth slack, a trail of brown water trickling down his chin. "Get away from that." Elias's voice was a rusted hinge, rough from disuse. The boy, Samuel, said nothing. He just held his ground, his small fists clenched. He was a scarecrow daring the storm. Elias took a step closer, unhooking the canteen from his saddle. He didn't offer it. He simply held it. The metal glinted in the sun, a promise of something clean in a world of dirt. "There's clean water at my place," he said, his words clipped. He wasn't asking them. He was stating a fact, as immutable as the heat. Samuel's eyes darted from Elias's face to the canteen, then back to the 2 children behind him. The girl, Ilara, coughed, a dry, rattling sound. The little one, Caleb, began to whimper, a low, exhausted cry. The boy's shoulders slumped, a barely perceptible surrender. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a pragmatism born of pure desperation. Elias gestured with his head back toward the direction of his ranch. "It's a mile. You can walk it." He didn't offer them a ride. He didn't know how. Kindness was a foreign language whose grammar he had long forgotten. He turned and began to walk, leading Jericho by the reins, not looking back to see if they were following. He didn't need to. He could hear them, the soft, shuffling sounds of their broken shoes in the dust. 3 little ghosts trailing in the wake of another. They reached the homestead as the sun began to bleed across the sky. The house stood dark. The empty swing set his son had loved hung motionless, a gallows for memory. He led Jericho to the trough, pumping fresh, clear water until it overflowed. He filled his canteen and walked toward the barn, leaving it on the ground 10 feet from the entrance. He didn't look at them. He went inside his house and shut the door, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence. Through the grimy kitchen window, he watched. They approached the canteen like deer at a salt lick, cautious, ready to bolt. The oldest drank first, then gave it to the girl, and finally to the little one, who drank until he choked, clean water spilling down the front of his rags. They did not approach the house. They retreated into the shadows of the barn, a fortress of hay bales and dust motes. Elias stood at his window for a long time, a century at the border of his own isolation, watching the darkness swallow the world. He was no savior. He was just a man who had stumbled upon a suffering more immediate than his own, and for the first time in 2 years, he did not know what he would do tomorrow. The first days were a silent negotiation. Elias would rise, perform his chores, and move through the landscape of his grief with the children as distant, watchful satellites. He would leave a plate of bread and jerky by the barn door in the morning, a bucket of fresh milk in the evening. It was always gone when he returned. He never saw them take it. They were specters, whispers in the periphery. He could feel their eyes on him as he split wood, the weight of their scrutiny as he repaired the corral fence. They were judging him, measuring his capacity for violence, for abandonment. Samuel, the oldest, was the most unnerving. He would sometimes appear at the edge of the woods, a silent, unmoving statue of distrust, his gaze a physical weight. Elias never acknowledged him directly. He simply continued his work, the rhythmic chop of the axe or the scrape of the hammer a steady, predictable answer to the boy's unasked questions. He was not a threat. He was just a man, working. The girl, Ilara, was a ghost of a different sort. He would catch glimpses of her peeking from behind the barn door, her face a pale oval in the gloom. She was an observer, cataloguing his movements, the cadence of his voice when he spoke to the horse. She was looking for a pattern, a weakness, a reason to believe this place was any different from the last. The youngest, Caleb, was the one who frayed the edges of Elias's carefully constructed emptiness. Sometimes, a small, frustrated cry would drift from the barn, quickly shushed by his older brother. It was a sound that scraped at a wound Elias thought had long since scarred over. It was the sound of a child, helpless and small. One evening, a storm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind began to howl, rattling the windows of the house like a trapped animal. The temperature plummeted. Elias stood on his porch, watching the rain come down in solid, angry sheets. He thought of the barn, of its drafty walls and damp hay. He thought of his own son, tucked warm in his bed during storms like this, the sound of the rain a lullaby. The memory was a knife twist. Without allowing himself to think, he crossed the muddy yard and threw open the barn doors. The three of them were huddled in a far corner, wrapped in a single, threadbare blanket, their bodies trembling. Samuel shot to his feet, a piece of sharpened wood clutched in his hand. "The house," Elias said, his voice loud over the thunder. "Get in the house." Samuel stood his ground, defiant. Ilara looked from Elias to her brother, her eyes wide with fear and a flicker of something else. Hope. It was Caleb's shivering that broke the standoff. His teeth were chattering, a sound loud enough to be heard over the storm. Elias didn't wait for permission. He stepped forward, scooped the small boy into his arms, and turned toward the house. The boy was weightless, a bundle of cold bones and damp rags. He didn't fight. He went limp, burying his face in Elias's shoulder. Samuel and Ilara followed without a word, trailing him into the warmth and light of the kitchen. He deposited Caleb onto a rug by the hearth, where a fire was already crackling. He threw another log on, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He didn't speak to them. He went to the pantry and came back with 3 bowls, which he filled with a thick stew from the pot on the stove. He set them on the floor, then retreated to a chair in the corner, watching. They ate like starving wolves, their heads bowed, the only sound the scrape of spoons against ceramic. When they were finished, he pointed to a back room. "There are blankets." Sleep they went, disappearing into the shadows of the small bedroom that had once been a nursery. Elias stayed by the fire, the storm his only companion. He did not sleep. He listened to the rain, to the quiet breathing from the other room, and felt the foundations of his solitude begin to crack. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The sun shone on a glistening, green landscape. The children emerged from the room, blinking in the morning light. They still clung to the edges of the house, but the desperate, feral edge was gone, replaced by a tentative curiosity. Later that day, as Elias sat on the porch step, cleaning a piece of tack, he felt a presence beside him. It was Caleb. The boy stood there for a full minute, silent, watching Elias's hands work the leather. Then, slowly, deliberately, the small, grubby hand of the child reached out and took hold of Elias's calloused index finger. The touch was electric. It shot through the layers of grief and isolation, a jolt of pure, unvarnished life. Caleb's grip was surprisingly strong, an anchor in the storm of Elias's past. He didn't pull away. He didn't speak. He simply held on, his small fingers wrapped tight, refusing to let go. Elias stopped working. He looked down at the boy's hand, then at his face. The child's eyes were clear, trusting. For the first time since he had buried his son, Elias felt a fissure in the dam of his sorrow. A single, hot tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just sat there, the sun on his back, the weight of a small hand a tether to a world he thought he had lost forever. The touch of Caleb's hand was a seed. In the days that followed, something began to grow in the barren soil of Elias's ranch. It was a fragile thing, easily trampled, but it was there. The children no longer slept in the barn. They claimed the small back bedroom as their own, a silent, mutual agreement passing between them and the quiet man of the house. The routine shifted. Elias now cooked for 4. The clatter of 3 extra spoons at the table became a part of the house's rhythm. They were still quiet, the children. Words were a currency they spent with great care. But their silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of fear, but of observation, of learning the contours of this new, strange peace. Elara began to help. She would sweep the porch without being asked, her movement small and precise. She followed Elias to the chicken coop one morning and, after watching him for a long while, shyly held out her hands for an egg. He placed one in her palm, its warmth and smoothness a stark contrast to the rough life she had known. Her smile was a small, brilliant sunrise that Elias had not realized he was waiting for. Samuel remained the most aloof, the last bastion of their old life of distrust. He shadowed Elias, a humorless apprentice watching his every move. But one afternoon, as Elias was struggling to reset a heavy fence post, he felt a pressure on the other end of the post. It was Samuel, his jaw set, straining with all his might to help. Elias looked at him, and the boy met his gaze, not with defiance, but with a flicker of begrudging respect. "Hold it steady," Elias grunted. Samuel nodded, digging his heels in. They set the post together. Nothing more was said, but the fence they mended that day was more than just wood and wire. It was the first plank in the foundation of a family. Elias found himself changing. The rigid lines of his grief began to soften. He started clearing the weeds from around the grave of his wife and son, not as a chore, but as a tender act of remembrance. He found himself in the old workshop one evening, the air thick with the scent of sawdust and memory. His hands, acting of their own accord, picked up a block of pine and a whittling knife. He worked late into the night, the shavings falling at his feet like shed skin. The next day, he left a small, crudely carved wooden horse on Caleb's pillow. The boy's gasp of delight was a sound so pure it echoed in the empty spaces of Elias's heart. This fragile piece felt both eternal and terrifyingly brittle. It was a house of cards built in a windstorm. He knew it. He felt it in the vast, watching silence of the plains. The world that had chewed these children up and spat them out was still out there. The knowledge was a low hum beneath the surface of their quiet days. The blow came on a Tuesday. Elias had ridden into the small, dusty town of Redemption for supplies. It was a place he avoided, a town full of people who knew his story, whose pity felt like sandpaper on his soul. As he was loading sacks of flour into his wagon, the town's sheriff, a man named Brody with a perpetually bored expression and a stained vest, approached him. "Thorne," Brody said, his voice flat. "Got a visitor in my office asking about you." Elias's gut tightened. "I'm not expecting visitors, this one's expecting you. Or rather, what you've got." And Brody gestured with his thumb toward the jailhouse. "Says you're holding property of his." 3 head. Small ones. Elias froze. The sacks in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, who it was. The past had come to collect. He followed the sheriff into the dim, stale-smelling office. Sitting in a chair, legs crossed, a smug smile playing on his lips, was a man whose cruelty was etched into the lines of his face. He was dressed in clothes too fine for the dust of this town, a silver-topped cane resting against his knee. He looked like a vulture in a tailored suit. "Mr. Thorne," the man said, his voice smooth and oily. "Silas Croft. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Croft held up a piece of paper. It was an indenture contract, the ink dark and official. The names Samuel, Ilara, and Caleb were written in a neat, cruel script. "Just a misunderstanding, I'm sure," Croft continued, his smile widening. "Children wander. But it's time for them to come home. The law is quite clear on the matter of property." The word hung in the air. Property. Elias looked from Croft's smug face to the official-looking document, then to the sheriff, who simply shrugged, the picture of bureaucratic indifference. The fragile peace of his ranch, the sound of Caleb's laughter, the quiet trust in Ilara's eyes, the grudging respect from Samuel, it all shattered in that single, obscene word. The windstorm had arrived. "They are not property." The words left Elias's mouth before he had consciously formed them. They were quiet, but they landed in the stuffy office with the force of a thrown stone. Silas Croft's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He looked at Elias with newfound interest, as if a piece of furniture had just spoken. "They are children," Elias repeated, his voice low and steady, a dangerous current running beneath the calm surface. Sheriff Brody shifted his weight, the leather of his gun belt creaking. "Now, Elias," he started, his tone condescendingly placating. "The man has a paper. A legal contract of indenture, signed by their father before he passed. Says they're to work for Mr. Croft here until their father's debts are paid." "Their father is dead," Elias said, his gaze locked on Croft. "The debt dies with him, not according to this," Croft purred, tapping the document with a manicured finger. "The debt is attached to his assets. And these, children, are his last remaining assets. I've come a long way for them. I don't intend to leave empty-handed." The sheer, unapologetic avarice of the man was breathtaking. He didn't speak of the children as human beings, but as livestock or tools to be reclaimed. Elias could see in Croft's cold eyes the entirety of the children's past suffering, the hunger, the beatings, the fear. It was all there, in the smug satisfaction of their tormentor. "The law's the law, Elias," Brody said with a sigh, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "My hands are tied." "He has the right to take them." "You'll have to go through me," Elias said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, as simple and unyielding as a mountain. Croft chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "A grieving homesteader playing at hero? I think not. I have the law on my side." He stood, smoothing the front of his vest. "We'll ride out to your ranch now, Sheriff. And we will collect what is mine." The ride back to the ranch was a funeral procession. Elias rode ahead, the weight of the coming confrontation pressing down on him, heavier than any grief he had ever known. He was not the same man who had found those children by the mud puddle. That man was a ghost, a hollow shell. This man, the man riding to meet a future he refused to surrender, had something to lose. As they crested the final rise, the ranch came into view. He saw them. The 3 children were on the porch. Ilara was holding the wooden horse. Caleb was standing close to her. And Samuel. Samuel was standing at the top of the steps, a pitchfork held across his chest like a rifle. He had seen them coming. Elias's heart clenched. The boy's bravery was as magnificent as it was futile. Croft spurred his horse forward, a cruel smirk on his face as he took in the scene. "Well, well," he called out, his voice dripping with mock affection. "Look what the cat dragged in. Did you miss me?" The children flinched as if struck. Ilara pulled Caleb behind her. Samuel's knuckles were white on the handle of the pitchfork. "Get off this land." Samuel's voice was a reedy cry, but it was filled with a lifetime of hatred. Croft laughed. "Brave words, boy. But your bravery ends today." He dismounted and started toward the porch. "Sheriff, you might want to handle this." Sheriff Brody sighed and swung his leg over his horse. Kids, come on down. We ain't got all day. Elias dismounted, placing himself directly in Croft's path. I told you, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You are not taking them. Croft's face darkened. The veneer of civility vanished, revealing the raw ugliness beneath. Step aside, old man, before you get hurt, he made to push past Elias. Elias's hand shot out and clamped onto Croft's wrist. His grip was iron. Croft gasped, his eyes widening in surprise at the strength in the quiet rancher's hands. They have a home, Elias said, his eyes burning with a cold fire. This is their home. For a moment, everything was still. The sun beat down. The only sound was the wind whispering through the grass. Then Croft snarled, wrenching his arm free. He swung his silver-topped cane, aiming for Elias's head. Elias ducked under the blow, the cane whistling past his ear. He didn't retaliate with his fists. He moved with the brutal efficiency of a man who knew what was at stake. He lunged forward, not at Croft, but at the porch steps. He grabbed the pitchfork from a stunned Samuel. Get inside, he roared at the children. All of you. Now. They scrambled into the house, slamming the door behind them. Elias turned, the pitchfork held low, its tines gleaming in the sun. He was no longer just Elias Thorne, grieving widower. He was a guardian. A protector. A father. Sheriff Brody drew his pistol. Elias, put it down. This is madness. But Elias's eyes were only on Croft. You wanted them, Elias said, his voice a low growl. Come and get them. Croft, enraged, drew a small, pearl-handled pistol from his coat. The confrontation had escalated beyond the law, beyond words. It had become a primal battle over the soul of a family, waged in the dust of a lonely ranch under a pitiless sky. The world narrowed to the space between the two men. The sheriff's warning, the wind, the slamming of the cabin door, it all faded into a dull roar. There was only Silas Croft, his face a mask of rage, and the small, ugly circle of the pistol's muzzle. There was the pitchfork in Elias's hands, its weight both foreign and familiar. It was a tool for turning hay, for tending to life. Now, it was a weapon to defend it. Croft fired. The shot was a sharp crack that sent a flock of birds scattering from the roof of the barn. Elias felt a searing heat rip through his left shoulder. The force of it spun him half around, and the pitchfork fell from his grasp, clattering on the hard-packed earth. He staggered, a grunt of pain escaping his lips. Blood began to soak through the fabric of his shirt, a dark, spreading flour. I warned you, old man. Croft spat, taking a step forward, his pistol still raised. He was smiling now, a triumphant, vicious expression. From his position on the ground, Elias looked past him, toward the house. Through the window, he could see three small, terrified faces pressed against the glass. Samuel. Ilara. Caleb. Their fear was a physical blow, more painful than the bullet in his shoulder. It was the look of children who had seen this before, the moment when the monster always wins. But the man on the ground was not their father, broken by debt and despair. The man on the ground had already lost everything once. He had nothing left to lose but them. That knowledge was a fire in his veins. As Croft took another step, savoring his victory, Elias lunged. Not upwards, but sideways, his body rolling through the dust, his hand closing around the fallen handle of the pitchfork. He came up on one knee, ignoring the screaming agony in his shoulder, and swung the heavy tool in a low, desperate arc. He wasn't aiming for Croft's body. He was aiming for his weapon. The steel tines connected with Croft's wrist with a sickening crunch of bone. The pearl-handled pistol flew from his grasp, landing yards away in the dirt. Croft screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and agony, clutching his shattered hand to his chest. He stared at Elias, his arrogance replaced by disbelief, then by fear. The quiet, broken rancher was gone. In his place was something primal, a force of pure, protective rage. Elias rose to his feet, the pitchfork held before him like a spear. He was bleeding, swaying slightly, but his eyes never left Croft. Every ounce of his grief, every lonely night and silent dawn, had been forged into this single, unwavering point of resolve. "Get off my land," Elias breathed, the words ragged. Sheriff Brody, who had been frozen in place, finally moved. He holstered his pistol, his face a mixture of shock and a dawning, reluctant understanding. He had come here to enforce the law, a piece of paper. But he had just witnessed a more fundamental law in action. "You heard him, Croft." Brody's voice was flat, but the indifference was gone. "Get out of here." Croft cradled his broken wrist, his face pale. He looked from Elias's blood-soaked shirt to the pitchfork, and finally to the sheriff. The fight was over. The bravado, the legal papers, the tailored suit, it was all meaningless in the face of such raw determination. Defeated, he stumbled to his horse, mounted awkwardly with his good hand, and rode away without a backward glance, a diminished figure disappearing into the vastness he had come from. The tension broke. The air rushed back into Elias's lungs, and the pain in his shoulder flared into a white-hot nova. The pitchfork grew heavy, and he let it fall. He sank to his knees, the dust rising around him. The door to the house creaked open. The children emerged slowly, cautiously. They saw the blood. They saw Elias on his knees. Ilara's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. Caleb began to cry. But Samuel, the boy who had met him with a glare of pure defiance, did something else. He ran. He ran to Elias's side, his small hands hovering, unsure of where to touch, unsure of how to fix this. "You're hurt," Samuel whispered, his voice thick with a new, terrifying emotion. Elias looked up at him, at the fierce loyalty burning in the boy's eyes, and he managed a weak, pained smile. "It's all right, son," he said. It's all right, he had called him son. And in that moment, under the vast and watchful sky, surrounded by the family he had bled for, Elias Thorne knew he was finally home. The wound in his shoulder would heal. But the wound in his soul, the great, hollow space carved out by loss, was already beginning to close, filled by the presence of 3 small, wounded souls who were no longer lost, and a man who had finally found his reason to live. We've just shared a story about finding family in the most unexpected of places. If you were moved by Elias's journey, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspirational stories like this one.